So now we come to the third learning outcome of this lecture, which is the legal formalities in investigating into sudden and unnatural deaths. Now I will explain this concept using certain examples and scenarios. Most of the time when deaths happen suddenly, the scenario may be in relation to a death at home, it may be in terms of death at a hospital, or it may be a body that is found outdoors. In whatever the situation, usually a doctor is expected to give a cause of death as to why or how this particular person died. Now, when a doctor has to give a cause of death, the doctor has to think of two things. Firstly, whether the doctor can give a cause of death, whether the doctor has enough information as to why this particular person died. The second thing is whether the doctor should give a cause of death or whether this death is reportable. Now this word reportable is very important in forensic practice because it generally defines what types of deaths have to be notified or informed to the legal authority. Now, in most scenarios, any unnatural death, you may remember that an unnatural death is accident, suicide, or homicide. Such deaths have to be reported for a legal investigation into the death. Similarly, if the cause of death is not known, in other words, it's a sudden death where the cause of death is not known or unexpected, they have to be reported. Certain situations such as prisons, mental hospitals, people under detention. In these situations, people are institutionalized without their consent. So when a death occurs in such institutionalized settings, even if the cause of death is unknown, even if the death is natural, it has to be referred to a legal authority. Similarly, if there is a doubt as to who the person is, where the identity of the person is not known, it has to be referred. If there is some suspicion of a negligent act, maybe due to some fault of someone, a certain accident happened, and you can imagine a scenario like, say for example, road traffic accidents, or because of some error in a particular person's safety procedure, someone else or even that particular person met with an accident or sustained some trauma and died. So in these such of situations, again, a legal investigation is required. So this legal investigation that happens into these deaths is given a term, and that is an inquest. Now this is very important. Inquests happen in different forms or different procedures in different countries. Mainly we can divide or we can see two main distinctions. One is called a medical examiner system, the other one is called a coroner system, coronal system. Now in Malaysia, the initiation of an inquest is done through the police. And of course, the police also have the authority to perform an inquest. But in other countries, like say for example in UK or USA, the police do not have the authority to perform an inquest. They can only initiate one. There are other people, for example in UK, there are people called coroners who have been given that authority to investigate legally into the death. Now, apart from this legal investigation, there can also be other expertise that are involved in this death investigation process. For example, during the process, medical experts or other scientific experts can also be included in the investigation of the death. And we'll see how medical expertise is brought in the subsequent slides. It would be useful for you all to have a look at this article, which is written from a Malaysian perspective in the procedures and also the structure of inquests that are conducted here in Malaysia. You can access this article if you just type in this URL, and that would give you the PDF of the article, which I would highly recommend you reading. So an inquest, as I said, is a legal investigation into a death, which is primarily done to detect or exclude a crime. And the procedure of this inquest is that mostly the visit to the scene where the body is lying, we refer to that as the scene of crime examination, is an important part, and this may be done by the police or this may be done by the relevant authorities such as the magistrate or a coroner. Now in Sri Lanka, in certain types of deaths such as homicides, institutionalized deaths, it is always the magistrate who gets involved. So the magistrate now visits the scene, then examines the body, maybe holds a certain type of public inquiry, investigating or inquiring from the eyewitnesses, relatives, as to what they think or what they know about the death, and all of that information is documented. There may be certain evidence, trace material that is collected from the scene, collected from the body, which is also then sent for subsequent tests, and all of these would be important in determining the cause as well as circumstances of the death in each of these situations. Now, sometimes the inquirer cannot determine the cause and circumstances of the death simply from this legal investigation. And in such situations, they may also require the assistance of medical experts to investigate into the death. So if a death has happened, let's say in a hospital situation, and the doctor decides that the death has to be referred for an inquest and does not give a cause of death, then what happens is the doctor will inform the police or the hospital authority that the death requires an inquest, and the police then decides to inform the legal authority to hold the inquest. And in Malaysia, as I said, the police themselves may initiate the inquest. And during this process, if the medical expertise is again required to investigate further, from the inquest there is an order for an autopsy, which is a forensic autopsy. So I hope this part is clear in terms of how the actual process happens, both in relation to the inquest as well as in relation to the forensic autopsy. And I would recommend you to test your knowledge a little bit by trying out these two MCQs, which you can access either by typing in this URL or by scanning in this QR code. So then let's move on to understanding how a forensic autopsy would help in these kind of situations. And from your lecture on autopsy, you may have understood that the general process of a forensic autopsy involves certain preliminary procedures where there would be establishing the identity of the deceased, establishing or ensuring that the autopsy could be done in a biosafe environment, and then proceeding into the other segments of the autopsy, such as external examination, dissection, ancillary investigations, and so on. Now, let's take, for example, a little case study. So, let's say a middle-aged man with a history of drug abuse, methamphetamine abuse, was arrested and detained by the police and kept in a cell. And about 12 hours later, when the police went to check on him, he was seen lying on the ground, unresponsive. They bring him to hospital, but then even by the time he arrives to the hospital, the person is dead. Now, of course, in this kind of situation, the cause of death is not known, and an inquest would obviously be initiated. And in most situations, there would also be a forensic autopsy. So really, this kind of death would have several medico-legal issues to consider. For example, we know that he is a methamphetamine abuser, so therefore the question whether this was a drug overdose would obviously come into play here. Similarly, the possibility of some kind of police assault or torture would be important, or this could be just a natural death. Or this could be a situation where there was some kind of violence between inmates and some intentional act by another inmate, for example, could have caused his death. Or maybe the person himself may have committed suicide by some means. So in this kind of situation, the forensic autopsy is very, very important. We would need to do a thorough external examination to make sure that we document any injuries, any changes in the person's health status, any markers of disease that would be important to identify a particular cause, the person's nutritional status, the general body build. All of these would give us clues as to whether this person was suffering from a particular chronic disease. In most forensic centers in developed countries, there is now forensic radiological facility available to do what is called a pre-autopsy radiology in these kinds of deaths. These are very important to identify certain traumatic situations, or for example, in this scenario, think about the possibility of this person being a drug mule. I think you know what a drug mule is where a person either swallows or conceals drugs with the intention of smuggling drugs. And often these drug mules tend to swallow drugs in little packets. And a CT scan would be very important in such situations to see whether the intestinal system contains such packets. The dissection process, as you would have heard from the previous lecture, basically involves routine dissections that commence from head to toe and examine the internal structures thoroughly. Now, in this scenario, we would, apart from dissections, we would also do a lot of tissue sampling and collection of trace material, especially because of the possibility of a drug overdose. We would consider postmortem toxicology very seriously, and the common samples that are taken are blood, urine, vitreous humor, which is seen here in this photograph, how vitreous humor is taken, which is taken from the eye using a syringe. Samples of hair would be taken, again to look at the chronic nature of this person's drug abuse. And the possibility of some kind of violent struggle between either inmates or with the police officers, it will be important to exclude and determine if the person, the victim, had struggled with another person. The possibility of certain DNA material being lodged in the victim's fingernails is important to analyze and assess. Histologically, the most important thing would be looking at the natural disease processes, microscopic changes that could identify certain types of sudden deaths. Not all sudden deaths, as I told you before, not all sudden deaths will be seen at autopsy. Sometimes they are macroscopically not visible, but may be seen under microscopy, or at least may give a clue to those particular types of deaths through microscopy. So we would basically take samples from every organ, and every organ would be examined as objectively as possible, including the weight, the size, the color, etc. And in this scenario, it is very important to perform special dissections, mainly to exclude any occult injuries, such as, for example, if there was torture of this person, usually the injuries are in very hidden places, such as maybe the sole of the feet, the back of the body. Now this dissection that you're seeing here is called a subcutaneous dissection. For example, if you look at this particular dissection that is shown here on the person's leg, you may notice that externally there is not much change in the color or the texture of the skin. But when dissected inwards, you'll see that there is a huge amount of bruising on the legs underneath. So especially in dark-skinned people, identifying injuries like contusions is very difficult at autopsy. So we had to do this type of subcutaneous dissection to identify these kind of occult injuries. This is a dissection of what is called the needle track mark. So usually a person who's taking in drugs through the intravenous route would have a lot of needle tracks on their arms, and these can be explored again using a subcutaneous dissection, and the presence of thrombophlebitis would be identified very easily using this type of special dissection. So once all these dissections are performed and all the samples are analyzed, once we have all the information that is needed to determine what really caused this person's death, the doctor would provide a medical certification of the cause of death. Now, of course, in a scenario like what was mentioned, there is a possibility that the findings would not be conclusive. In other words, the findings would not provide a valid reason for the person's death. In such situations, the cause of death would be considered as unascertainable or undetermined. And the importance of this is that then the investigation would still be open, and there would be other investigators who would then be coming in to try and see if there is definitely any kind of criminal activity that could have been involved. Now, of course, if the cause of death is determined as natural causes, then there are certain things to consider. We would need to consider whether this particular natural cause was drug related, or especially whether it was something that is familial, and therefore it would be of importance to inform the family and especially refer them for screening or to certain other areas which would then manage these people to prevent the occurrence of such diseases in those people. Of course, if trauma is detected and if the death is deemed as unnatural, then the next consideration would be determining culpability. Culpability means identifying who is responsible for the death. And through the forensic autopsy, it may be possible to identify the persons who were involved in this unnatural circumstances, mainly through the DNA fingerprinting that is done if there were certain material that was transferred on the person's body. So this is the basic process of how an autopsy assists in the investigation of sudden natural deaths. It is not a comprehensive description of the process, and certainly depending on the case scenario, depending on the complexity of the circumstances surrounding the death, the type of investigation and the manner in which the investigation would be conducted would be highly variable. So that brings us to the end of this lecture. I would be quite happy to answer any questions that you have. You could send those questions either via Teams or via email, and I will try my best to answer them and help you to clarify the points better. I would recommend that you read up a little bit more about the inquest procedure and also the manner in which deaths are handled, especially in Malaysia, and also some information about the differences between the inquest procedures in different countries. At least differences between the medical examiner and the coroner system would also be useful for you to get a good understanding about how the investigation process works. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you all have a good day ahead. Thank you.